In the windswept prairie town of Cinder Bluff, where hope is as scarce as rain, Maybelle Hart steps off the train with nothing but her worn carpet bag and a dream of belonging. Her clubfoot has made her an outcast all her life. But this mail order, bride advertisement, promised a fresh start. Then her intended takes one look and walks away, leaving her to face the cruel laughter of strangers. Just as despair threatens to overwhelm her, a quiet cowboy named Eli Boone steps forward, offering his coat and something far more precious, acceptance. With calloused hands and a gentle stutter, this penniless ranch hand sees what others miss: the strength behind her limp, the grace in her determination. But in a town where cruelty runs deep as prairie roots, can their tender love survive the storm that's coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cinder Bluff's weathered platform as Maybelle steadied herself against a wooden post. Her legs ached from the 3-day journey, but it was the weight of stairs that truly tested her balance. She'd carefully memorized the advertisement: seeking gentle-hearted lady for marriage to established merchant. Must be literate, religious, and of sound character. Clutching the wrinkled newspaper clipping in her palm, she searched the crowd for Mr. Theodore Hammond. The photograph he'd sent showed a stern-faced man with neat whiskers and a high collar. When their eyes finally met, his expression shifted from expectant to horrified in the space of a heartbeat. "This must be some sort of mistake," he announced, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. His voice carried the sharp edge of public humiliation. "I specifically requested. This won't do at all." Maybelle's fingers tightened around her carpet bag. She'd seen that look before, the way people's eyes dropped to her twisted foot, then darted away as if her condition might be catching. But she'd traveled too far to crumble now. "Mr. Hammond," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "I believe we've corresponded these past 3 months. I've brought the letters." Letters can be deceiving, can't they? A woman's shrill laugh cut through the air. "Didn't mention that little defect of yours, did you?" The crowd had grown, drawn by the promise of afternoon entertainment. Maybelle felt the familiar heat of shame creeping up her neck, but she held her head high. 28 years of sideways glances and whispered comments had taught her the art of dignity under fire. "I was entirely truthful in my letters," she said, each word measured and clear. "About my character, my education." "Education?" Hammond's laugh was cruel. "I run a respectable business in this town. What would people say if—" He gestured vaguely at her foot, as if the mere sight of it might taint his reputation. "No, this won't do at all. I'm sure you understand." The station master shifted uncomfortably behind his desk, suddenly very interested in his ledger. A group of young boys had gathered at the platform's edge, pointing and snickering. Maybelle felt the walls of her carefully constructed hope beginning to crack. That's when she heard it. A quiet voice, rough as prairie grass but gentle as morning dew. "Ain't right, treatin' a lady that way." The crowd parted slightly, revealing a tall figure in dust-covered work clothes. His broad-brimmed hat was pulled low, but Maybelle caught the flash of kind eyes beneath its shadow. He moved with the easy grace of someone who spent more time in a saddle than on polished floors. Hammond's face reddened. "This is a private matter, Boone. Best mind your own business. Reckon common decency is everybody's business," the man replied, his voice gaining strength despite a slight stutter on the word everybody. He took a step forward, and Maybelle noticed his hands, strong and calloused, but careful as he reached for his coat. "Evening's coming on cold, ma'am. You might want this." The coat was well worn but clean, and it carried the scent of sage and honest work. As he draped it over her shoulders, Maybelle caught a glimpse of the quiet strength in his face. Not handsome in the conventional way, but something far more valuable, genuine. Cinder Bluff's streets turned to copper in the setting sun, the day's dust settling like memory around their feet. Maybelle matched her pace to Eli's, who she noticed had slowed his stride to accommodate her without drawing attention to it. His consideration ran quiet and deep, like an underground spring. "Been here long?" she asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them since leaving the station. 5 years come winter. His stutter seemed to ease when he wasn't confronting anyone. "Started as a ranch hand at the R, saved enough to buy a small piece of land." He glanced at her, then away. "It ain't much, but it's mine." They passed the general store, where Hammond's name was painted in proud letters across the window. Maybelle held her head higher, though her heart still ached from the public humiliation. A pair of women whispered behind their hands as they passed. "Folks'll talk themselves tired soon enough," Eli said softly. "Then they'll find something new to gossip about. You seem familiar with their ways. Town's got opinions about anyone different." He touched his throat self-consciously. "My words don't always come easy. Some find that reason enough for judgment." Maybelle understood then. His kindness came from a place of shared experience. Before she could respond, they reached a 2-story building with a weathered sign reading, "Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house." "This is it," Eli said, setting down her bag. "Mrs. Whitaker's fair-minded, at least." He hesitated, then added, "Though her rates ain't exactly gentle." Maybelle's hand went to her pocket, where her carefully saved money lay. After the train ticket and supplies, there wasn't much left. She'd counted on Hammond's offer being genuine. "I should have enough," she began, but Eli was already shaking his head. "There's something else you might consider," he said, the words coming slowly, deliberately. "I've got a small cabin on my land. Nothing fancy, but there's a spare room. Used to be my ma's before she passed." He looked at her directly now, his eyes honest and clear. "You could stay there, no charge, until you figure your next steps." The offer hung in the air between them, weighty with possibility and risk. Maybelle studied him. This quiet man who'd shown more kindness in an hour than she'd known in years. "People would talk," she said, testing his resolve. "People already talk." A small smile touched his lips. "Besides, I've got a reputation and think of too, known as the stubbornest ranch hand in 3 counties. Be ashamed to lose that now." Despite everything, Maybelle found herself smiling back. "You're serious about this offer?" "Got a good vegetable patch," he continued, growing more animated. "Chickens, too. Could use help with the eggs. My hands are too rough. Break more than I save sometimes." He paused, then added softly, "And maybe you might want to stay longer, if things work out." The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in shades of promise. Maybelle thought of all the careful plans she'd made, the dreams she'd built around Hammond's letters, but perhaps God had a different plan. One that started with a borrowed coat and a kind heart. "I'd need to see this cabin first," she said. Carefully. Course." Relief flooded his face. "Got my wagon just down the street, unless—" He glanced at her foot with concern. "I can manage," she assured him. "I've learned to judge my limits, Mr. Boone." "Eli," he reminded her gently. "And I reckon you've learned to exceed them too." As they walked toward his wagon, Maybelle felt something she hadn't expected to find in Cinder Bluff. Hope, fragile as a spring seedling but just as determined to grow. She was still wearing his coat, she realized. Somehow, it felt right. The wagon rolled steadily through the gathering dusk, each turn of the wheels carrying them further from town and its judgments. Maybelle watched the landscape change. Prairie grass silvered by starlight, the distant silhouette of mountains like sleeping giants against the sky. Eli handled the reins with quiet confidence, occasionally pointing out landmarks. "Creek there. Never runs dry," he said, nodding toward a ribbon of water gleaming in the moonlight. "Good fishing when there's time." His voice carried the warmth of someone sharing something precious. Cabins just past that stand of cottonwoods. As they rounded the trees, Maybelle caught her first glimpse of what might become her home. The cabin sat like a promise against the darkness, small but sturdy, with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. A lantern burned in the window, and Maybelle wondered if Eli had lit it that morning, never guessing who'd see its welcome by days. "And you left a light burning?" she asked, curious. "Every morning," he admitted, helping her down from the wagon. "Ma always said a house needs to look ready to welcome folks home, even if you don't expect anyone." His hands were strong but gentle, and he waited patiently as she found her footing on the packed earth. The cabin's porch creaked a greeting beneath their feet. Eli opened the door, and warmth spilled out, not just from the banked fire in the hearth, but from the care evident in every detail. The main room was neat as a pin, with a well-swept floor and curtains that showed signs of careful mending. A hand-carved rocking chair sat by the fire, a quilt draped over its back. The walls held shelves lined with books, more than Maybelle expected, and dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafters. "Books were Ma's," Eli explained, noticing her gaze. "She taught at a school back east before marrying Pa. Said learning shouldn't stop just because you move west." He set her carpet bag down carefully. "Your room's through here, if you'd like to see it." The second room was small but sweet, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt and a window that would catch the morning sun. A bureau stood against one wall, its wood polished by years of careful hands. "It's lovely," Maybelle said softly, meaning it. The room held echoes of the woman who'd lived here before, but it didn't feel haunted. It felt waiting. "There's a latch on the door," Eli pointed, out his voice careful. "And I sleep in the loft upstairs. You'll have your privacy." He'd thought of her comfort, her sense of security. Maybelle felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Thank you, Eli." "Hungry?" he asked, moving back to the main room. "Got some stew warming. Nothing fancy, but it's filling. I'd like that." She followed him, taking in more details: the neat stack of firewood by the hearth, the orderly arrangement of cooking utensils, the small table with its pair of chairs. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his solitary home, but wouldn't mind sharing it. As Eli moved around the kitchen, ladling stew into bowls, Maybelle noticed his hands trembling slightly. He was nervous, she realized, as nervous as... She was about this unexpected arrangement. Somehow that made her feel better. "I can help with meals," she offered, "and the garden you mentioned. I'm good with growing things." "Already planning to stay?" There was hope in his question, carefully banked like his morning fire. "Let's say I'm considering it." She accepted the bowl he offered, their fingers brushing briefly. "Though I should warn you, I sing while I work. Old hymns mostly." "Cabin could use some music," he said softly. "Been too quiet since Ma passed." They ate in companionable silence, the stew rich with vegetables from his garden. Through the décal window, Maybelle could see stars scattered like grain across heaven's fields. The town felt far away, its cruelties diminished by distance and the simple rightness of this moment. "I'll need to send a letter," she said finally. "To my aunt in Ohio. She'll worry if she doesn't hear from me. Post rider comes by twice a week." Eli gathered their empty bowls. "And I've got paper and ink if you need it. I'd appreciate that." Maybelle watched him move around the cabin, so careful in his own space. "Eli? What made you offer me this? Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, arranging the bowls in the wash basin. "Sometimes," he said finally, his words slow but sure, "a person just knows when something's right. Like finding the perfect spot to dig a well, or knowing when a storm's coming." He turned to face her. "You stepped off that train, and something in my heart said, 'Oh, there you are.'" Dawn broke over the cabin like a watercolor painting, all soft edges and promise. Maybelle woke to the sound of quiet movement, Eli's boots on the porch boards, the gentle clatter of breakfast preparations. She'd been here a week now, and already the rhythm of mornings felt familiar as her own heartbeat. In her room, she opened the small leather journal she'd brought from Ohio, adding another entry to its pages. "The miracle isn't in the grand gestures, but in the small ones. How he always ensures the water bucket is full before I wake, knowing the carrying is harder for me. How he hung a rope between the cabin and the chicken coop, so I have something to hold during muddy weather. He never mentions these things, just does them, as natural as breathing." She closed the journal, tucking it into its drawer. Through the window, She could see Eli in the garden, his broad shoulders bent over the morning's work. He was talking to the plants again, a habit that had surprised her at first, then endeared itself to her completely. "Morning," she called, softly, stepping onto the porch. He straightened, hat tipped back, face warming with a smile that still held traces of surprise at finding her there. "Sleep well?" His stutter was barely noticeable now when they were alone. Made coffee. They settled into their morning routine. Eli tending the animals while Maybelle gathered eggs, her touch gentler than his work-roughened hands. She'd learned to balance herself against the nesting boxes, finding ways to work around her limitation rather than fighting it. "Found a new recipe," she said over breakfast. "That woman at church, Mrs. Peterson, she shared her sourdough starter. Said it's been in her family 3 generations. That's quite a gift." Eli understood the significance. In these parts, a sourdough starter was precious as gold, passed down through families like an heirloom. "I think she approved of how I handled the Widow Jenkins boys yesterday." Maybelle smiled at the memory. The young troublemakers had tried to mock her limp during Sunday service, but she'd turned it into a teaching moment about Jacob wrestling with the angel. Sometimes the best way to handle meanness is to answer it with grace. "You've got grace. Enough for the whole territory," Eli said softly, then ducked his head as if surprised by his own boldness. The days had fallen into a pattern, but not the rigid kind that traps. Rather, the sort that grows and breathes. Maybelle tended the garden while Eli worked the land. She'd started keeping books for him, her neat figures bringing order to his scattered receipts. In the evenings, she read aloud from his mother's books while he carved small wooden figures by the fire, but it was the in-between moments that shaped their growing companionship. The way he'd pause in his work to watch her hang laundry, offering a steadying hand without making her feel weak. How she learned to recognize the tension in his jaw that meant his words were fighting to come out, and would wait, patient and understanding, until they found their way. "Got a letter today," Eli mentioned that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the prairie gold. "From the Triple R. They're looking for extra hands for the roundup. Good money in." "That," Maybelle said carefully. They both knew what went unsaid, that his small farm needed every penny it could get. "Be gone 3 weeks." He glanced at her, worry creasing his brow. "Don't like the thought of leaving you alone." "I'm capable," she reminded him gently. "And Mrs. Peterson said she'd look in on me. Besides," she smiled, "someone needs to keep your mother's roses blooming." The roses were her latest project, spindly bushes that hadn't flowered in years, now showing signs of new growth under her care. Like everything else in this place, they just needed patience and attention to reveal their beauty. "You'll be here when I get back?" The question held more than its simple words. Maybelle looked out at the land that had become home, at the garden where her vegetables grew alongside his, at the path between cabin and coop that bore the imprint of her adjusted gait. "Yes," she said softly. "I'll be here." Something shifted between them then, subtle as a change in wind direction. They sat in companionable silence as darkness gathered, each thinking of the word home, and how its meaning could expand to hold 2 hearts instead of 1. Saturday's market day brought Cinder Bluff to life, wagons and carts lining the dusty main street like beads on a string. Maybelle sat straight beside Eli in his wagon, a basket of fresh eggs and garden produce between them. Her hair was neatly pinned, her dress pressed crisp as new paper. If her hands clutched the basket too tightly, well, that was between her and God. "Ready?" Eli asked softly as they approached the crowd. His own tension showed in the careful way he held the reins. His shoulders squared as if preparing for battle. "As I'll ever be," she managed to smile. "Those eggs won't sell themselves." They'd arranged their goods carefully on a borrowed table, eggs nestled in clean straw, tomatoes gleaming like jewels, beans tied in neat bundles with twine. Maybelle had arranged everything just so, remembering her aunt's lessons about presentation. "People eat with their eyes first," she'd always said. The first customers approached cautiously, drawn by the quality of their produce, but held back by the town's lingering judgment. Maybelle met their hesitation with calm dignity, answering questions about her growing methods and offering recipes along with the vegetables. "These tomatoes look better than mine," Mrs. Peterson admitted, examining one with expert fingers. "What's your secret?" "Coffee grounds in the soil," Maybelle shared, "and talking to them doesn't hurt." A small crowd gathered, attracted by Mrs. Peterson's approval. Maybelle felt Eli's quiet presence behind her, steady as a mountain. He handled the heavier items, his stutter barely noticeable as he discussed weather and crops with the men who'd previously ignored him. Then Theodore Hammond appeared, his shop's shadow falling across their table like an early frost. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough to draw attention. "Quite the cozy arrangement you two have worked out." His eyes flickered meaningfully between them. "Though I wonder what the good Reverend would say about two people working honest land and selling honest goods." Eli's voice was quiet, but carried clearly. "Reckon he'd say that's exactly what the good book recommends." Several onlookers nodded approval. Hammond's face darkened. "Some might question the propriety of your living arrangement. Some might question the propriety of breaking a written promise to a lady." Mrs. Peterson cut in tartly. "How many eggs did you want, dear?" she asked Maybelle, pointedly turning her back on Hammond. The moment passed, but its electricity lingered. More customers came, perhaps drawn by the drama, perhaps by the genuine quality of their goods. Maybelle's careful bookkeeping showed a profit by day's end, not large but honest. As they packed up, a small girl approached their table, one leg dragging slightly. Her mother hovered anxiously nearby. The child stared at Maybelle with frank curiosity. "You walk like me," she said simply. Maybelle knelt carefully to meet her eyes. "So I do, and look how far we both can go." "Sarah, don't bother," the mother began, but Maybelle held up a hand. "She's no bother." She selected a perfect red tomato and held it out to the child. "For you, they're sweetest when you grow them." "Yourself," the girl's face lit up, her mother's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered, and Maybelle knew she meant more than the tomato. Loading the wagon for home, Eli worked in comfortable silence until everything was secure. "You're changing things," he said finally. "People are starting to see." "We're changing things," she corrected gently. "Together." The sun was setting as they drove home, painting the sky in colors that reminded Maybelle of her tomatoes. She felt tired but satisfied, like good soil after rain. "Hammond won't let it rest," she said quietly. "No," Eli agreed, "but we won't either." His hand found hers on the wagon seat, work-roughened fingers twining with her own. "You did good today." "We did good," she echoed, and felt his smile even though she wasn't looking at him. The road home stretched before them, and for the first time, Maybelle realized she was exactly where she wanted to be. The weather turned restless in the days before Eli's departure for the Triple R. Clouds gathered and scattered like uneasy thoughts, and the wind carried warnings in its voice. Maybelle found him studying his mother's old almanac one evening, its pages worn soft as leather from years of careful reading. "Storm's coming," he said without looking up. "Bad one by the signs." She'd learned to trust his weather sense. The land spoke to him in a language born of years of careful listening. "Before you leave?" "During, most likely." His finger traced the almanac's predictions. "Shouldn't affect the roundup much. We'll be west of it." He glanced up, worry creasing his brow. "But here." "I'll manage," she assured him, though her heart clutched at the thought of facing her first prairie storm alone. "Mrs. Peterson showed me how to secure the storm shutters, and I've been storing extra water. It's not just the storm I'm worried about." Eli closed the almanac carefully. Hammond's been asking questions about property lines, water rights, things a merchant shouldn't care about. Maybelle sat in the rocking chair his mother had loved, her hands folded in her lap. "You think he's planning something?" "Man like that. He's used to getting his way." Eli's stutter emerged slightly, betraying his concern. Losing you publicly, it wounded his pride, and wounded pride can turn mean as a rattler. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, wind rustled through the cottonwoods like whispered secrets. Maybelle thought of Hammond's cold eyes at the market, the way he'd watched their success with barely hidden malice. "I could delay going," Eli offered quietly. "Triple R would understand." "No," her voice was firm. "We need that money, especially if Hammond's plotting something. Besides," she managed a smile, "what better way to show him he hasn't won than to carry on as planned?" Eli studied her face in the firelight, his eyes soft with something more than concern. "You're the strongest person I know, Maybelle Hart." "I've had practice," she said simply. Then, to lighten the mood, "Now let me check your pack again. I don't trust your sock-darning skills." The next morning brought more signs of the approaching storm. Birds flew low and nervous, and the air held the metallic taste of distant lightning. Eli worked from dawn to dusk, checking every board and nail of the cabin, reinforcing what needed strengthening. Maybelle watched him from the garden, where she was harvesting what might be damaged by wind. His care for her safety spoke louder than any words of devotion could. "Found something," he said that evening, bringing out a small wooden box. "Ma's old emergency fund. Not much, but—" he pressed it into her hands. "Just in case." "Eli, please." His voice was rough with emotion. "Would rest easier knowing you had it." She accepted the box, understanding this wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about being chosen as the keeper of his mother's legacy. That night, unable to sleep, Maybelle wrote in her journal, "Tomorrow he leaves, and I find myself counting the things I haven't said. How his kindness has become as necessary as air. How his quiet strength makes me stronger. How this cabin has become more home in weeks than any place has been in years. But perhaps some things are better proven than spoken, like the way he reinforced every window today, or how I'm darning his socks by candlelight, each stitch a small prayer for his safe return." A knock at the door startled her from writing. Eli stood there, looking apologetic. "Saw your light. Should have known you'd be up too." "Come in," she said softly. "I'll make tea." They sat at the kitchen table, sharing the comfortable silence they'd learned together. Finally, Eli spoke. "Been thinking, when I get back, maybe we could talk about making this arrangement more permanent, if you're willing." Maybelle's heart stuttered like a candle in wind. "You mean I'm not good with words, but I'm good at knowing what's right. And this, us, it's right as rain." He met her eyes steadily. "Don't need to answer now, just think about it." Outside, thunder rolled across the prairie like God clearing his throat. The storm was coming, but in that moment, Maybelle felt nothing but warmth. "I'll think about it," she promised, though her heart had answered long ago. The first morning after Eli's departure felt strange as a dream. Maybelle woke to a silence deeper than usual, broken only by the restless wind and the distant rumble of thunder. His absence seemed to take up physical space, like a shadow cast by the sun. She'd promised herself she wouldn't waste time with melancholy. There was work to be done, and she'd learned long ago that purpose was the best medicine for loneliness. Still, she found herself touching things he'd left behind. The coffee cup on the shelf, his mother's almanac on the table, the half-finished wooden figure by his chair. The storm's approach brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah, the little girl, from the market, appeared at her door just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. "Mama sent me," she said, balancing carefully on her weak leg. "Said you might need help battening down for the storm." Her eyes were bright with purpose. "I'm good at helping." Maybelle recognized the pride in the child's voice, the need to be useful despite what others might see as limitation. Perfect timing. I could use a hand with the chickens. Together, they worked through the morning, Sarah proving surprisingly capable at gathering eggs and spreading fresh straw. Maybelle watched how the girl had developed her own ways of moving, adapting to her body's demands, just as Maybelle had. "Miss Hart?" Sarah asked as they finished. "Could you teach me to read? Mama tries, but she's so busy with the little ones." The question stirred something in Maybelle. Memories of her own schoolroom back east, before her father's death had changed everything. "You know, I used to be a teacher." "Really?" Sarah's eyes widened. "But Mr. Hammond told everyone you were just a—" She stopped, blushing. "Just a what?" "A mail-order mistake," Sarah whispered, then lifted her chin defiantly. "But he's wrong. About lots of things." Maybelle felt a familiar pain, but it was overshadowed by an idea taking root. "Would your mama mind if we started lessons tomorrow? We could use Eli's mother's books." "She'd be glad. Says I need learning more than pity. Bye." The time Sarah's mother came to collect her, Maybelle had a plan forming. The storm might keep them housebound for days, perfect time for teaching. And not just Sarah, there were other children in outlying farms who couldn't make the long trip to the town school. That evening, as rain drummed on the roof and lightning painted the windows in brief, brilliant flashes, Maybelle wrote in her journal, "Today I remembered who I was before the world tried to make me smaller. Teaching was never just a job, it was a calling. Perhaps that's why God led me here, to this cabin with its shelf of waiting books and a child eager to learn." Eli's mother taught back east before coming west. Did she too dream of bringing knowledge to this wild place? The next days brought more than just the storm. Word spread about the teaching offer, and soon Mrs. Peterson arrived with 2 more children, siblings whose family lived too far from town for regular schooling. "Hope you don't mind," she said, wringing rain from her shawl. Their mother nearly wept at the chance, been worried sick about them falling behind. Maybelle set up a makeshift classroom in the main room, using the fireplace slate for figures and letters. The children sat on cushions, eager faces glowing in the lamplighters. The storm raged outside. She taught them reading and sums, but also songs to remember their letters and games that made learning feel like play. "You've got a gift," Mrs. Peterson observed, watching from the doorway. "Shame to waste it." "Nothing's wasted," Maybelle replied, thinking of all the turns her path had taken to bring her here. "Everything teaches us something, if we're willing to learn." The storm lasted 4 days, and by the time it cleared, something had shifted in Cinder Bluff's social winds. Mothers who had previously avoided her eye now stopped to chat about their children's progress. Even the Reverend, hearing of her impromptu school, paid a call. "We've been needing someone with proper teaching experience," he said, studying her with thoughtful eyes. "Our last schoolmaster left 2 months ago. Position still open, if you're interested." Maybelle thought of Eli's quiet support, of Sarah's eager mind, of all the other children who needed what she could give. "I'd need to discuss it with Eli when he returns," she said carefully. "This is his home too now." The Reverend nodded, understanding, more than she'd said. "Take your time, though I suspect Mr. Boone will be proud to have a schoolteacher for his—" He paused, diplomatically. "For his friend." After he left, Maybelle stood in the doorway, watching the sun break through the clouds. The storm had changed more than just the landscape. It had revealed something she'd almost forgotten, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in enduring alone, but in having something precious to share. Eli returned on a Tuesday evening, dust-covered and weary, but his face lit up at the sound of children's voices spilling from his cabin. He sat astride his horse for a long moment, watching through the window as Maybelle led a reading lesson, her hands graceful as she traced letters in the air. Sarah spotted him first. "Mr. Boone's back," she called, and the spell of study broke like a soap bubble. Maybelle turned, and their eyes met through the window. Something passed between them, quiet as a prayer and just as powerful. "Class dismissed," she said softly, and the children gathered their things, filing past Eli with excited greetings as he dismounted. Mrs. Peterson, who'd taken to staying during lessons, gathered the youngest ones. "Welcome home," she said meaningfully, shepherding the children toward their waiting wagon. "You've missed quite a few changes." Then they were alone, standing on either side of the threshold, like 2 people at the edge of something vast and wonderful. Eli's hand went to his pocket, where his mother's ring had rested against his heart throughout the roundup. "You've been busy," he said finally, voice rough with more than trail dust. The storm brought unexpected blessings. Maybelle moved to take his saddlebags. "Are you hungry? There's stew keeping warm." "Starving." But he caught her hand before she could turn away. "Missed you something fierce." They moved around each other in the familiar kitchen space, falling into rhythms that felt both old and new. Eli washed up, while Maybelle served the stew, adding fresh biscuits she'd baked that morning. The coffee pot bubbled companionably on the stove. "Tell me everything," he said, and she did. About the storm, the children, the Reverend's offer. His eyes never left her face, drinking in every word like a man who'd been thirsting for this moment. "The school board meets next week," she finished. "They want me to present my credentials." "You'll do it." There was such hope in his voice. If you think it would be proper, given our situation." Eli stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his coffee cup. "Wait here." He disappeared into the bedroom that had been his mother's, returning with something clutched in his broad, work-roughened hand. "Been carrying this since I left," he said, his stutter more pronounced with emotion. "Planned some fancy words, but they don't seem necessary now." He opened his palm, revealing a simple gold band that caught the lamplight like a captured star. "This was my Mars. She said to give it to someone who made the cabin feel like she did, like home." And hope all mixed together. Maybelle's breath caught. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dusk, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes sang their wild songs to the rising moon. But here, in this moment, the whole world had narrowed to Eli's earnest face, and the ring gleaming in his palm. "I know I ain't much," he continued, words coming faster now, as if afraid they'd desert him. "Got more debts than dollars, and my words still tangle when I'm nervous. But I've got strong hands for working, a heart that knows its own mind, and a love for you that grows surer every day." "Eli," Maybelle's voice was barely a whisper. "Let me finish while I've got the words gathered up right." He knelt carefully, beside her chair, mindful of her comfort even now. "You came here looking for a husband and found nothing but hurt. I came to town that day looking for nothing and found everything. Will you marry me, Maybelle Hart? Make this home we've been practicing at into something real and lasting." Tears spilled down Maybelle's cheeks, but her smile was bright as sunrise. "Did you practice that speech on the trail?" "Every night," he admitted, a shy grin breaking through his nervousness, though it came out different each time. This version was perfect. She held out her hand, trembling slightly. "Yes, Eli Boone. Yes to the debts and the tangled words and the strong hands and the heart that knows its mind. Yes to making this home real. Yes to everything." The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Eli's hands shook as he placed it, then lifted her fingers to his lips. "The schoolmaster's wife," he said wonderingly. "They'll have to accept you now." "They already were," she said softly. "But I don't care about that anymore. I only care that you do." "Always have," he whispered, "since the moment you stepped off that train." News traveled fast in Cinder Bluff, carried on the same winds that brought autumn's first chill. By Sunday morning, every eye in the little church watched as Maybelle and Eli walked in together, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, his mother's, ring catching the light from the stained glass windows. Reverend Mills smiled as they passed, a quiet blessing in his nod. Mrs. Peterson beamed from her usual pew, and Sarah waved excitedly until her mother shushed her. But Theodore Hammond's face darkened like a thunderhead when he saw them, his fingers tightening on his leather-bound Bible. The sermon was about Ruth's loyalty, about choosing love over easier paths. Maybelle felt the words settle around her shoulders like a shawl of belonging. Eli's hand found hers during the final hymn, his deep voice harmonizing with her soprano as naturally as their lives had woven together. They were nearly to their wagon when Hammond's shadow fell across their path. "Well, if it isn't Cinder Bluff's newest arrangement." His voice dripped false concern. Though I wonder, Miss Hart, if you've considered the legal implications of your situation." Eli stepped forward, but Maybelle's hand on his arm held him steady. "What implications would those be, Mr. Hammond?" "Only that certain contracts were made." Hammond's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Certain expenses paid, the matter of your train ticket, for instance, and the advertisement costs." "I believe we settled that account," Maybelle replied evenly, remembering the scattered letters on the platform. "Along with any obligations attached to it." "Did we?" Hammond glanced meaningfully at the school board members gathering near the church steps. "I'd hate for any questions to arise during your teaching application about contracts or character." "That's enough." Eli's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of steel. "You want to talk contracts? Let's discuss the one you broke first." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the tension crackling like static before a storm. Hammond's face flushed. "I made no binding agreement, didn't you?" Mrs. Peterson's sharp voice cut through the murmuring. She pulled a folded paper from her reticule. "Found this in my Edgar's old letters. He was quite impressed with your business acumen, brother, especially your careful documentation of each mail order arrangement. For tax purposes, you said." Hammond's flush deepened to purple. Behind him, the school board members exchanged glances. "Now see here," he began, but Mrs. Peterson was already handing the paper to Reverend Mills. "Seems to me," the Reverend said mildly, adjusting his spectacles, "that this bears your signature, Mr. Hammond, and quite specific terms about financial and moral obligations to the lady in question." He folded the paper carefully. "Including, I note, a non-refundable deposit, which makes your breach of contract the only legal concern here," Mrs. Peterson added sweetly, "unless you'd like to discuss it further, perhaps with Judge Wilson next time he circuits through." Hammond's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he turned on his heel and stormed away, nearly bowling over young Sarah, who had been watching, wide-eyed from behind her mother's skirts. "Mrs. Peterson," Maybelle said softly when the crowd began to disperse, "how did you—" "My Edgar was Hammond's business partner before the fever took him," the older woman replied. "Kept copies of everything. I always thought that particular correspondence might prove useful someday." She patted Maybelle's hand. "Besides, someone needed to remind Theodore that pride comes before a fall." On the ride home, Eli was unusually quiet. Finally, as the cabin came into view, he spoke. "He won't let this rest. Man like that. Being shamed. Publicly, no," Maybelle agreed. "He won't." She touched the ring on her finger, drawing strength from its solid presence. "But we've faced worse storms." "Together," Eli added, and there was both promise and warning in the word. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the prairie in harvest colors, Maybelle wrote in her journal, "Strange how trouble can bring gifts wrapped in thorns. Today, I learned the depth of Mrs. Peterson's friendship, saw the Reverend's quiet strength, felt the town's ground shift beneath our feet. Hammond meant to shake our foundation, but instead revealed how many pillars now support us. Yet Eli's, right, this isn't over. I see it in Hammond's eyes, that wounded pride festering like a poisoned well. But I've learned something in my time here on the prairie. The strongest flowers are those that grow through adversity, their roots reaching deep for sustenance, their faces turned always toward the light." Eli's hand settled warm on her shoulder, and she covered it with her own. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, the school board meeting, Hammond's next move, the thousand small challenges of building a life together. But tonight, in the gathering, darkness, they had this: a home built on choice rather than chance, love earned rather than arranged, and strength tested by storms yet standing. The schoolhouse sat empty and waiting, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun like watchful eyes. Maybelle stood before the weather-worn door, her credentials folder clutched in one hand, Eli's mother's teaching certificate tucked inside. Like a talisman, Eli stood beside her, solid as an oak. "Remember," he said softly, "you don't have to do this. We'd manage fine without—" "I want to," she interrupted gently. Not for the money, not for acceptance. For Sarah and all the other children who need what I can give them. Inside, the school board had assembled, 5 men and 2 women who held the future of Cinder Bluff's education in their hands. Hammond sat among them, his position as the town's leading merchant, buying him influence he hadn't earned. But Reverend Mills was there too, and Mrs. Peterson's cousin Emily, who had taught school herself before marriage. "Miss Hart," the board chairman began, then caught himself. "Soon to be Mrs. Boone, I understand. Your credentials, please." Maybelle moved forward with the dignity she'd learned through years of proving herself. Her limp was more pronounced today, her leg aching with the coming weather, but she held her head high. One by one, she laid out her qualifications, her teaching certificate from Ohio, letters of recommendation, even samples of her students' work from her previous position. "Impressive," Emily noted, examining a particularly well-done arithmetic sheet. "And you've already begun teaching some of our outlying children?" "During the storm," Maybelle confirmed. "And after, when their parents asked me to continue." "Irregular," Hammond cut in. "Teaching children without proper authority." "Showing initiative," Reverend Mills corrected mildly. "Meeting a need she saw unfilled. Isn't that what we're looking for?" The questions continued, about her methods, her experience with different age groups, her plans for the curriculum. Maybelle answered each one clearly, drawing on years of classroom experience and weeks of teaching Sarah and the others. Then Hammond leaned forward, his face a mask of concern. "And your condition? How can you manage a classroom of energetic children with your limitation?" The room grew silent as a held breath. Eli's chair scraped against the floor as he started to rise, but Maybelle's hand found his shoulder, steadying them both. "My condition, Mr. Hammond, has taught me more about teaching than any college could. It taught me that every child learns differently, that what some see as limitation, others see as opportunity. That strength isn't about how fast you can run, but how steadily you can move forward." She smiled at Sarah, who had slipped into the back of the room, and that sometimes the best lessons aren't found in books at all. Emily was nodding, and even the chairman looked impressed, but Hammond wasn't finished. "And what of your living situation? The example you're setting, living unchaperoned with—" "We're to be married next month," Eli interrupted, his voice clear and strong without a trace of stutter. "By Reverend Mills himself, though I don't see what that has to do with teaching arithmetic." "Everything to do with moral character," Hammond pressed. "The children's parents have already spoken." Mrs. Peterson's voice rang from the doorway. She wasn't a board member, but she'd brought half the mothers in the district with her. "We've seen Miss Hart's character in action, seen how she treats our children, how she builds them up instead of tearing them down. We've made our decision." The chairman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Peterson, this is a closed meeting." "Then close it," she replied firmly. "After you've heard what these mothers have to say about who they want teaching their children." One by one the mothers spoke, about Sarah's newfound confidence, about children suddenly eager to learn, about how Maybelle had turned the storm's imprisonment into an adventure of discovery. Their words filled the room like sunlight, pushing back Hammond's shadows. Finally the chairman called for a vote. Hammond's face was dark with fury as the hands went up. 6-1 in favor of hiring Maybelle as Cinder Bluff's new teacher. Outside, as the autumn wind played with fallen leaves, Eli took Maybelle's hand. "Proud of you," he said simply. "Proud of us," she corrected, watching Sarah demonstrate her new reading skills to her beaming mother. "We're building something here, Eli. Something bigger than just us. Bigger than Hammond, too," he added, but his eyes were worried, though he'll try to tear it down. Maybelle squeezed his hand, feeling the strength of his calluses against her palm. "Let him try. Some things, once built, can't be broken. They can only grow stronger." Above them, wild geese flew south in perfect formation, their calls carrying on the wind like distant bells. Maybelle watched them go, thinking of journeys and destinations, of paths chosen and paths discovered. She had come to Cinder Bluff seeking a husband, but she had found something more precious, a purpose, a partner, and a place to plant hope like seeds in fertile ground. The first snow of the season dusted Cinder Bluff like sugar on a wedding cake, and preparations for both winter and the upcoming marriage kept Maybelle and Eli busy from sunup to sundown. She divided her time between teaching and creating a home, while he worked double time to ensure the cabin would be warm and secure for the coming months. The surprise came on a Saturday morning, when a wagon train of sorts appeared on their road. Women from town, led by Mrs. Peterson, their vehicles, loaded with mysterious bundles and covered baskets. "It's called a quilting bee," Mrs. Peterson announced, sweeping into the cabin like a general leading troops. "Though we'll be doing more than quilting today." Before Maybelle could protest, the women had taken over her home. They hung the promised quilt in the main room. A beautiful piece, worked in secret over the past weeks, each square containing good wishes and blessings for the new couple. But that was just the beginning. "Every new bride needs a proper hope chest," Emily declared, unveiling a cedar box that her husband had crafted. One by one, the women added their contributions: hand-embroidered linens, preserved fruits, carefully wrapped silverware passed down through generations. "We can't accept," Maybelle began, overwhelmed by their generosity. "Hush," Mrs. Peterson interrupted kindly. "This isn't charity, this is community." She pressed a small package into Maybelle's hands. "Besides, some of us have waited years to show Theodore Hammond what we think of his high and mighty ways." The package contained a delicate lace collar that had belonged to Mrs. Peterson's daughter, lost to fever before she could wear it at her own wedding. "Mary would have wanted you to have it," she said softly. "She never did care for people who judged others without knowing their hearts." While the women transformed the cabin, Sarah organized the younger girls into a decorating committee, using dried flowers and ribbons to create simple but charming arrangements. Her little face glowed with purpose as she directed operations from her seat by the window. "Miss Hart," she called out proudly, "I wrote out all the labels for the preserves myself. Extra practice for school." Maybelle examined the careful lettering, her heart full. "Beautiful work, Sarah. You've come so far." "Thanks to you," Sarah's mother said quietly, joining them. "She reads to her siblings every night now." Even her pa's started listening. The morning turned to afternoon, filled with the comfortable sounds of women working together, sharing recipes, trading stories, offering advice both practical and personal. Maybelle found herself drawn into their circle as naturally as thread. Through a needle's eye, her initial discomfort fading with each shared laugh and gentle touch. Then came another surprise. The men arrived, led by Reverend Mills and Sarah's father, carrying tools and lumber. Eli, who had been working in the barn, emerged to find his property transformed into a buzzing worksite. "Thought you might need help with those winter preparations," the Reverend said simply. "Many hands make light work." While the women continued inside, the men set about weatherproofing the cabin and barn, repairing what needed fixing, and adding a few improvements they deemed necessary for a proper home. Eli worked alongside them, his usual reserve softening in the face of their easy acceptance. "Never thought I'd see the day," he confided to Maybelle during a quiet moment. "Most of these folks never gave me the time of day before. Maybe they just needed to see you through new eyes," she replied, watching as Sarah's father showed a younger man how to properly seal a window frame. "Sometimes it takes one person changing their view for others to realize what they've been missing." The day wore on, and more townspeople arrived, bringing food and supplies and willing hands. Even those who had once turned away from Maybelle's limping gait or Eli's stuttered speech now found themselves caught up in the spirit of community that had taken root in the prairie soil. As evening approached, Mrs. Peterson unveiled one final surprise: a feast laid out on tables borrowed from the church, everyone contributing what they could. Lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the gathered faces as Reverend Mills offered a blessing. "Look what you've started," Eli whispered to Maybelle as they watched their neighbors share food and conversation, children playing together in the yard's first snow. "Not me," she corrected softly. "Us. And them too. Sometimes people just need permission to be their better selves." Later, after the last wagon had departed and the cabin settled into candlelit quiet, Maybelle added a new entry to her journal. "Today, I witnessed a miracle as common as bread and as precious as gold, the miracle of belonging. Each stitch in the quilt, each nail hammered, each dish shared, was a declaration. You are one of us now, not despite our differences, but somehow because of them. We've given this community something they needed without knowing it. Proof that love doesn't require perfection, only persistence, and in return, they've given us more than objects to fill a hope chest. They've given us hope itself." Eli found her there, writing by lamplight. Without a word, he wrapped his warm hands around hers, and together they stood at the window, watching snow erase the wagon tracks leading to their door. Tomorrow would bring new tracks, new paths, new connections. They were no longer alone against the prairie winds. The letter arrived on a bitter December morning, carried by the same post-rider who had once delivered Hammond's promises to Maybelle. She recognized the legal letterhead from Copper Springs, the nearest large town, and her heart sank even before she broke the seal. She waited to read it until the children had gone home, not wanting her worry to shadow their lessons. The schoolhouse felt suddenly colder as she unfolded the crisp paper, despite the crackling wood stove. "Legal notice," it began, "regarding the matter of property rights and contractual obligations." Eli found her there an hour later, still staring at the document's careful script. One look at her face, and he knew. "Hammond?" She nodded, passing him the letter. "He's claiming the school board's decision was improper, says there are moral character clauses in the teaching contract that I violated, and—" she took a shaky breath. "He's challenging your land claim." Eli's face darkened as he read. "Says the original survey was wrong, that half our property, including the creek rights, belongs to his new mining venture." His hands trembled slightly, but his voice stayed steady. "Convenient timing. There's more." Maybelle touched the final paragraph. "He's filed these claims with Judge Wilson, wants them heard before he circuits back to Copper Springs next week, right before our wedding date." Eli's jaw tightened. "He means to force us out one way or another." The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The setting sun painted the snow-covered prairie in shades of rose and gold, but its beauty felt distant now, like a happiness belonging to someone else. They found Mrs. Peterson waiting at the cabin, her face grave. "Heard about Hammond's latest scheme," she said without preamble. "Half the town's talking about it. News travels fast," Maybelle said wearily, but the older woman shook her head. "Travels even faster when Hammond makes sure of it. He's been in his store all day, showing anyone who'll listen some fancy survey map, talking about regrettable but necessary legal action and moral standards of the community." Her voice dripped with disgust. "Even offered to buy out your claim, Eli. Says it would be the generous thing to do given the circumstances." Eli's hands clenched on the reins he still held. "Generous like a snake offering to swallow a mouse." "What can we do?" Maybelle asked quietly. "We can't afford a lawyer from Copper Springs, not with winter coming on, and the wedding is exactly what he's counting on." Mrs. Peterson finished. "He thinks you'll give in rather than risk a public hearing. Knows most folks won't want to travel to Copper Springs this time of year to speak for you." But there was something in her tone, a hint of satisfaction that made both Maybelle and Eli look closer. "Sarah's mother came to see me this morning," the older woman continued. "Brought some interesting papers that her husband found in the county office. Seems he's been doing some research of his own, ever since Hammond started asking about old property lines." She pulled a folded document from her reticule. "The original survey of this land wasn't done by the county at all. It was done by my Edgar, may he rest in peace, and he kept copies of everything." Eli took the paper with careful hands, his eyes widening as he read. This shows that Hammond's new survey is about as honest as his business practices. Mrs. Peterson's smile was sharp as winter frost. Edgar may have been his partner, but he never did trust Theodore's bookkeeping, kept his own records, including the water rights agreements Hammond now claims don't exist. Maybelle sat heavily in her mother's old rocker, hope and fear warring in her chest. Will it be enough? Judge Wilson's a fair man, Mrs. Peterson said, and he has a particular dislike for those who try to manipulate the law for personal gain. But, she hesitated, you'll both need to be in Copper Springs to present this evidence. And Hammond knows that weather this time of year could make the journey dangerous, Eli finished. He looked at Maybelle, and in his eyes she saw the same question that burned in her heart. How much were they willing to risk for their future? She thought of her students, of Sarah's proud smile when she read aloud, of the community that had gathered to fill their home with gifts and blessings. She thought of Hammond's smug certainty that they would yield rather than fight. We'll go, she said firmly. Whatever it takes, Eli nodded, his decision matching hers. Together, Mrs. Peterson watched them with bright eyes. Good, because I have a few more surprises that Theodore Hammond won't see coming, including who else is willing to make that journey to Copper Springs. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of another storm. But inside the cabin, around the warmth of their determination, plans began to take shape. Plans that would either secure their future or lose them everything they'd built together. The journey to Copper Springs took 2 days through bitter winter weather, their wagon joining a small caravan of unexpected allies. Reverend Mills led the way, followed by Sarah's father driving a wagon carrying Mrs. Peterson and Emily from the school board. Behind them came 3 more families, whose children Maybelle had taught, each bringing their own evidence of Hammond's questionable dealings. Eli had insisted Maybelle ride in the enclosed wagon, where he'd arranged straw bales and warm blankets, knowing how the cold affected her leg. But she spent most of the journey sitting beside him, on the driver's seat, wrapped in his coat and her own determination. Quite a sight we must make, she said, as they crested a hill overlooking Copper Springs. The town sprawled below them, its buildings more numerous than Cinder Bluffs, smoke rising from countless chimneys into the steel-gray sky. Like an army, Eli agreed, his voice holding a touch of wonder. Never thought I'd see the day folks would stand with us. She touched his hand where it gripped the reins. You've earned their loyalty, Eli. Both of us have. The courthouse dominated the town square, its red brick walls rising stern and imposing above the surrounding buildings. Hammond's fine carriage already stood outside, his hired lawyer from Denver pacing the steps in an expensive coat. Remember, Mrs. Peterson said as they gathered in the courthouse's crowded anteroom, let them show their hand first. Edgar always said Theodore's worst enemy was his own pride. Judge Wilson proved to be a lean, weathered man, with eyes sharp as a hawk's. He listened without expression as Hammond's lawyer presented their case, laying out elaborate maps and property documents with flourishing gestures. Furthermore, Your Honor, the lawyer concluded, Miss Hart's contract with Mr. Hammond, though subsequently broken, established certain moral and financial obligations which preclude her current arrangement. The school board's decision to hire her was therefore made without full knowledge of these prior commitments. I see. Judge Wilson's voice was dry as prairie grass. And the property dispute? A simple matter of correcting an earlier survey error, Your Honor. Mr. Hammond's business interests require access to the water rights currently claimed by Mr. Boone. We're prepared to offer fair compensation for land that was never his to claim, Eli interrupted, his stutter gone in the face of righteous anger. He stepped forward, holding out Edgar Peterson's original survey. Your Honor, I have here objection. Hammond's lawyer said smoothly. Mr. Boone has no legal representation. Any documents he presents are admissible in my court. Judge, Wilson cut in, this isn't Denver, Counselor. Out here we hear a man's words before we judge their worth. One by one, their witnesses came forward. Mrs. Peterson presented her husband's meticulous records, showing how Hammond had tried to alter property lines before. Sarah's father, who worked in the county office, brought documentation of other claims Hammond had challenged and lost. Then Maybelle stood, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, Mr. Hammond speaks of moral obligations. Let me tell you about those." She drew out her teaching certificate, the letters of recommendation, the examples of her students' work. "I came to Cinder Bluff, seeking a fresh start. What I found instead was a community that judged me not by my limitations, but by my capabilities." She told of the children who needed education, of the parents who trusted her with their future, of the love that had grown as naturally as prairie. Flowers between her and Eli. "And the only moral obligation I recognize," she finished, "is to the truth. And the truth is, Mr. Hammond's claims spring not from justice, but from wounded pride." "Lies!" Hammond burst out, his face mottled with rage. "This crippled woman and her stuttering farmer have turned the whole town against me with their pathetic display of—" "That's enough." Judge Wilson's voice cracked like a whip. "Mr. Hammond, in my experience, those who resort to cruel names reveal more about their own character than those they seek to diminish." He lifted Edgar Peterson's survey. "These documents appear genuine, and more telling than any paper is the fact that half your town traveled through winter weather to speak against your claims." He turned to Maybelle and Eli. "The school board's decision stands. As for the property dispute," he smiled slightly, "I suggest, Mr. Hammond, that you focus on your existing holdings rather than attempting to acquire more through questionable means." The courtroom erupted in quiet cheers. Hammond stormed out, his expensive lawyer trailing behind, but Maybelle hardly noticed, too caught up in the warmth of Eli's embrace and the congratulations of their supporters. "Told you Edgar's records would come in handy," Mrs. Peterson said, wiping tears from her eyes, "though I suspect it was less the papers and more the people that swayed him." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and gentle as forgiveness. Eli helped Maybelle down the courthouse steps, both of them pausing to watch the white flakes dance in the winter light. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Home. The word held so much now. Their cabin, their land, their community, their future. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." The journey back to Cinder Bluff felt lighter somehow, despite the deepening snow. Their caravan moved slowly through the white landscape, spirits high with victory. But it was Emily who brought the final piece of Hammond's puzzle, shared over. "Coffee?" when they stopped to rest the horses. "Found this while going through my mother's keepsakes," she said, passing a faded photograph to Maybelle. "Thought you should see it." The image showed a younger Theodore Hammond standing beside a woman in a wheelchair, his face softer then, almost kind. The woman's smile was gentle, her hand resting in his. "His wife," Emily explained quietly. "Catherine. She taught at the school. Before any of us, back when Cinder Bluff was just starting. Had a condition that gradually weakened her legs." Maybelle stared at the photograph, understanding blooming like winter roses in her chest. "What happened?" "She died in childbirth, along with their baby. Some said it was the hard prairie life that weakened her too much. Others blamed Hammond for not sending her back east to her family." Emily's voice was soft with old sorrow. "After that, he changed. Started measuring everything and everyone against some impossible standard of perfection, as if by controlling everything around him he could prevent any more loss. The revelations settled over their group like fresh snow. Even Mrs. Peterson's usual sharp tongue was softened by this glimpse of Hammond's buried pain. "Doesn't excuse what he did to you," Eli said firmly, his arm protective around Maybelle's shoulders. "No," she agreed. "But it helps me understand." She traced the woman's face in the photograph. "She looks happy here, despite everything." "She was," Emily said. "Mother said Catherine used to tell her students that limitations were just God's way of showing us different paths to the same destination." The weather worsened as they approached Cinder Bluff. forcing them to take shelter in the old Watson barn just outside town. As they settled in for the night, sharing blankets and stories, Maybelle found herself thinking about paths and destinations, about how pain could either open a heart or seal it shut. "Penny for your thoughts?" Eli asked, bringing her a cup of hot coffee, thinking about Hammond, actually, and Catherine. She leaned against him, grateful for his solid warmth. All this time, he wasn't really fighting us. He was fighting old ghosts. "Still chose to hurt you," Eli reminded her, but his voice was thoughtful. "Yes, but tomorrow's Christmas Eve, and I find myself wanting to offer something like peace." She smiled at his questioning look. Not forgiveness exactly. That would need his remorse first, but understanding, maybe. A chance to let old wounds heal. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having swept away to leave everything fresh and clean. As their wagons approached town, they saw Hammond outside his store, supervising the unloading of supplies. He stiffened at their approach, pride and something else, regret perhaps, warring on his face. Maybelle asked Eli to stop the wagon. With careful movements, she climbed down and approached Hammond, the photograph in her hand. Emily showed. "Me this," she said simply, holding it out. "Catherine looks like she was a remarkable woman." Hammond's hands trembled slightly as he took the photograph. For a moment his public mask slipped, revealing the grief he'd carried for so long. "She was," he said roughly. "She never let anything stop her, until life did what life sometimes does," Maybelle finished gently. "It wasn't your fault, Mr. Hammond, just as my leg isn't my fault, or Eli's stutter isn't his. They're just different paths." He looked at her then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing, not a reminder of his loss, but a person in her own right. "She would have liked you," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Would have said I was a fool to—" "Perhaps we can start again," Maybelle offered. "Not as friends, necessarily, but as people who share a town and a future. There's room, enough in Cinder Bluff for all our stories." Hammond straightened, his businessman's mask slipping back into place, but something had shifted in his eyes. "The school board meets next week to discuss spring term supplies. I may have some suggestions for improving the building's accessibility." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was a beginning. Maybelle nodded, accepting it for what it was, as she turned back to their wagon, where Eli waited with patient understanding. She heard Hammond call out softly, "Miss Hart, thank you for giving me back her smile." The winter sun broke through the clouds then, turning the snow-covered town into a sea of diamonds. Maybelle thought of Catherine's words about different paths, about how sometimes the longest road led exactly where you were meant to be. Christmas Eve transformed Cinder Bluff into a wonderland of lamplight and goodwill. The church glowed with candlelight, evergreen boughs decorated every doorway, and the air held the promise of both ending and beginning. For Maybelle and Eli, it marked 1 week until their wedding day, though in many ways they felt already married by the trials they'd faced together. "Everything's ready," Mrs. Peterson announced, bustling into the schoolhouse where Maybelle was, finishing the last lesson before holiday break. "The ladies' auxiliary has outdone themselves with the preparations, though I had to rein in some of their more elaborate ideas. Told them you'd want something simple and true, like your love itself." Maybelle smiled, watching her students pack up their books and slates. Sarah lingered behind, clutching a carefully wrapped package. "It's for your wedding," she said shyly. "Mama helped me make it, but I did most of it myself." Inside was a hand-stitched bookmark, decorated with pressed flowers from Maybelle's own garden. The stitching was uneven but determined, each stitch a testament to Sarah's growing confidence. "For your teaching Bible," Sarah explained. "So you'll think of us when you read it." Maybelle gathered the girl into a careful hug, mindful of both. Their limitations but celebrating their shared strength. "It's perfect," she whispered, "just perfect." Later that evening, as she and Eli walked home through the gentle snowfall, they passed Hammond's store. The merchant was outside, supervising the installation of a wooden ramp over his front steps. "For deliveries," he said gruffly when he caught them looking. "And other purposes." His eyes flickered to Maybelle's cane, then away. "Catherine always said a store should welcome everyone." Eli's hand tightened on Maybelle's arm, but his voice was neutral. "Good lumber you're using there. Should last years." "That's the idea." Hammond hesitated, then added, "I hear you're still looking for wedding music." "Catherine's piano? It's been sitting silent too long. If you'd like to use it." The offer hung in the air like frost crystals, delicate and unexpected. Maybelle thought of the photograph, of Catherine's smile, of how love could echo through years, if given the chance. "We'd be honored," she said softly. The week passed in a whirl of preparation and celebration. The whole town seemed determined to make their wedding a symbol of new beginnings. Children decorated the church with paper chains and pine cones. Women baked and cooked enough to feed half the territory. And men appeared daily at the cabin with small improvements. A new shelf here, a repaired hinge there. Even the weather cooperated. The sun breaking through winter clouds on their wedding morning to set the snow glittering like scattered diamonds. Maybelle stood in her room at Mrs. Peterson's house, where tradition had insisted she spend her last night as a single woman, wearing her simple white dress and Catherine's lace collar. "Something borrowed, something new," Mrs. Peterson said, fixing the collar with careful hands. "Though I'd say you've borrowed more than lace from Catherine, you've borrowed her way of turning hardship into grace." At the church, Hammond's piano had been positioned near the altar, polished to a warm glow. Sarah sat proudly at its bench, her weeks of secret practice evident in the way she played the wedding march with careful determination. Eli waited at the altar, his usual work clothes replaced by a new suit, but his eyes holding the same steady love she'd first seen on that long-ago train platform. His stutter emerged only once during their vows, on the word cherish, and somehow that made it all the more precious. Because, as he told her later, some words carry more meaning than our hearts can easily hold. The celebration afterwards spilled out of the church and into the street, with tables set up despite the cold and bonfires blazing to warm the dancers. Hammond's piano was carefully transported to the town hall, where Sarah played simple tunes. She'd learned specially for the occasion. In a quiet moment between dances, Maybelle found herself standing next to Hammond, both of them watching the celebrations. "Catherine would have loved this," he said softly, almost to himself. "She always said Cinder Bluff needed more music, more joy." "Then we'll make sure it has both," Maybelle replied, "for her memory and for our future." He nodded once, sharply, then walked away. But the next day, a delivery wagon would arrive at the schoolhouse carrying Catherine's old teaching materials, carefully preserved through the years. The evening ended with Eli and Maybelle riding home in their wagon, now decorated with ribbons and good wishes. The winter stars blazed overhead, like heaven's own wedding lanterns, and the air held the clean scent of pine and possibility. "Happy?" Eli asked softly as their cabin came into view, lamplight glowing in welcome. Maybelle looked at their home, thought of their journey, of the community that had become family, of the love that had grown from the soil of shared struggle, and bloomed in the light of acceptance. "More than happy," she said, "content, complete, like a story finding its perfect words." "Not ending, though," he said, helping her down from the wagon with practiced care. "No," she agreed, taking his arm, as they walked toward their future. "Just beginning." Spring came early that year, as if nature itself celebrated their fresh start. The prairie awakened with tender green shoots pushing through melting snow, and Maybelle's garden began showing signs of the abundance to come. But the real growth was happening inside the schoolhouse, where something remarkable was taking shape. It started with Sarah's mother bringing her younger children to sit in on lessons. Then came the Watson boy's father, rough hands wrapped around a primer, as he admitted he'd never learned his letters properly. Soon, Maybelle found herself teaching evening classes for adults who'd missed their chance at education. Never too late to learn, she told them, thinking of all the ways life taught its lessons. Every season brings its own wisdom. Eli supported her expanding role with quiet pride, often sitting in during evening sessions, working on his own reading between, helping with the farm's spring preparations. His stutter improved with practice, and he began leading some of the agricultural discussions, teaching others about soil management and crop rotation. "You've started something special here," Reverend Mills observed one evening, watching adults and children alike poring over books in the lamplit schoolhouse. "A true community of learning." Maybelle smiled, remembering Catherine's old teaching materials that now helped a new generation. "We're all teaching each other, really. Mrs. Watson showed us all how to card wool yesterday, and Mr. Jensen's going to demonstrate proper fence mending next week." The school board, seeing the success of these expanded programs, voted to allocate funds for additional supplies. Even Hammond contributed, arriving one day with a wagon load of slate boards and chalk. "Found these in the store's back room," he said gruffly. "Catherine ordered them years ago, time they were put to use." At home, Maybelle and Eli settled into the rhythms of married life as naturally as breathing. Their cabin expanded to include a proper library corner where Catherine's books mingled with new ones, and the garden doubled in size to accommodate both flowers and vegetables. Every Sunday, Sarah came for extra reading lessons and stayed for dinner, her presence filling their home with young energy. One warm evening, as they sat on their porch watching thunderheads build over the distant mountains, Eli took Maybelle's hand. "Got something to show you," he said, his voice holding barely contained excitement. Behind the barn, hidden under canvas, stood a surprise that brought tears to her eyes. A small buggy with a specially modified step and handrail. "Sarah's father helped design it," Eli explained, his stutter barely noticeable in his enthusiasm. "And Hammond's craftsman built it. Whole town pitched in, actually. Thought you might like something of your own for getting to school, especially on days when your leg—" Maybelle ran her hands over the smooth wood, noting all the thoughtful details that would make it easier for her to maintain her independence. "It's perfect," she whispered, "like everything else that's grown from this place." That night, she wrote in her journal, "Sometimes I think about that day at the train station, how what seemed like an ending was really a beginning. Every perceived limitation has become a gateway to understanding. Every struggle an opportunity for growth. Eli and I are teaching this community as much about love as I'm teaching about letters and numbers. Today, I watched Sarah help one of the adult students sound out a difficult word, both of them focused and determined, neither concerned about their different challenges. Mr. Watson, who could barely write his name 2 months ago, now reads stories to his children every night. Mrs. Jensen brings her special bread to share during evening classes, and everyone's learning to sign a few words. So the Cooper's deaf son feels more included. Hammond stopped by today with more of Catherine's old books. He's different now, not soft exactly, but less brittle. He started teaching a weekly mathematics class, showing the older students how to manage accounts and calculate interest. "Catherine always said education was about more than books," he told me. "It's about building bridges between who we are and who we could be." The evening grew dark around their cabin, fireflies beginning their dance over the spring grass. Eli came in from his last check of the animals, his presence filling their home with quiet contentment. "Good day?" he asked, settling into his chair by the fire. "The best kind," she replied, closing her journal. Tommy Watson wrote his name for. The first time, Sarah helped teach the younger children their numbers, and Mr. Jensen finally mastered long division. "Sounds like victory all around." He smiled, reaching for the book they'd been reading together. "Ready for the next chapter?" Maybelle looked at their home, at the walls that had witnessed so much growth, at the books that held so much promise, at the man who had seen her strength when others saw only limitation, and felt the deep rightness of every choice that had led here, always, she said softly. I'm always ready for the next chapter with you." Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle as a blessing on their roof. Inside, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Maybelle and Eli continued their own story, adding new pages to a tale of love that had grown as naturally as prairie flowers after rain. 1 year to the day after Maybelle stepped off the train in Cinder Bluff, another woman arrived, clutching a newspaper advertisement and hope in equal measure. Like Maybelle before her, she carried visible signs of life's challenges. In her case, a twisted arm that had never healed properly after a childhood accident. But this time, when she descended from the train, uncertain and afraid, she found not cruel laughter, but a welcoming committee. Maybelle stood at its head, leaning on her cane with the quiet dignity that had become her hallmark. Beside her, Eli waited with the specially made buggy, ready to transport their guest to the boarding house where Mrs. Peterson had prepared a room. "Welcome to Cinder Bluff," Maybelle said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Boone, and this is my husband, Eli. We saw your response to the teaching assistant position." The woman, Miss Rebecca Collins according to her letters, blinked in surprise. "But my arm, I thought when you saw—" "We saw exactly what we were looking for," Maybelle interrupted gently. "Someone who understands that the best teaching comes from having faced challenges of one's own." Later that evening, as they drove home through the golden prairie sunset, Eli reached for Maybelle's hand. "Reminded me of another autumn day," he said softly, "though this one turned out a mite different." "Because we're different," she replied. "All of us, this whole town." Their cabin had grown over the year, with a new room added for their library of teaching materials and community gatherings. Sarah was there waiting, setting up for the evening's adult reading circle. At 13, she'd become Maybelle's unofficial assistant, her own limitations forgotten in the joy of helping others learn. "Miss Collins seems nice," she said, arranging chairs in a careful circle. "Think she'll stay?" "That's up to her," Maybelle answered, "but Cinder Bluff has a way of growing on people now." The evening brought their regular gathering. Mr. Watson proudly reading aloud from his favorite newspaper column, Mrs. Jensen sharing her newly mastered writing skills, even Hammond contributing a lesson on business mathematics. The cabin filled with the warm sounds of learning and community, of friendship forged through shared struggle and triumph. After everyone had gone, Maybelle sat at her desk to make her final journal entry in the book she'd brought from Ohio. 1 year ago, I stepped off a train into what I thought was the end of my dreams. Instead, I found their beginning. This town that once seemed so cruel has become a tapestry of healing and hope, each thread strengthened by the others around it. Today we welcomed someone who reminded me so much of myself, carrying the same fears I once held. But she stepped into a different Cinder Bluff, one that has learned to see with better eyes and judge with kinder hearts. Eli just brought in the first roses from his mother's bush, blooming stronger than ever under our shared care. Like this town, like our love, like every worthy thing, they needed only patience, nurturing, and the courage to grow through whatever weather came. Tomorrow, I'll start a new journal, but I'll keep this one close, not to remember the pain of that verse day, but to remind myself that sometimes life's hardest moments are simply love's way of teaching us where we truly belong. She closed the journal just as Eli came in from his evening chores. He carried something behind his back, a plain, wooden box that he set carefully on her desk. "Happy anniversary," he said, the words coming smooth and sure after a year of love's daily practice. Inside lay a new journal, its leather cover carved with prairie flowers and a single perfect rose. On the first page, in Eli's carefully practiced handwriting, were the words, "For my wife, who teaches us all that the greatest strength lies in the courage to keep blooming." Maybelle traced the letters, remembering the man who once struggled to speak in public, now leading agricultural discussions, teaching others what he'd learned about helping things grow. "We've all bloomed here," she said softly, Through the window, they could see Cinder Bluff's lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. The town seemed to glow with more than just lamplight. It shone with the warmth of community rebuilt, of lessons learned, of love that had grown strong enough to transform not just two hearts, but an entire town. "Ready for the next chapter?" Eli asked, echoing words that had become their private blessing. Maybelle looked at their home, at the roses blooming against all odds, at the man who had seen her perfection when she needed it most. "Always," she answered, "with you, always." And in that moment, as evening settled soft as a prayer around their shoulders, they stood together in the future they'd built. Two people who had found that life's greatest healing comes not from hiding our scars, but from using them to light the way for others.